Good evening, everyone. You are very welcome to the Parents Matter webinar. The panel will be delighted to receive any questions you may have. Please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your PC or laptop screen. If you are using an iPad, you will find this feature located at the top of your screen. We'll now hand you over to your host, Jason Farrell. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Jason Farrell, and I will be hosting tonight's Parents Matter webinar. So this webinar series aims to support parents on the topic of drugs and adolescence. Just bear with me. Okay, this webinar series aims to support parents on the topic of drugs and adolescence, as I said. So through this series of expert discussions, we aim to provide you with factual information to help you navigate this area and assist you to provide you with education on prevention on the use of substances in your home with your teenager. This is our second webinar following a successful first event in partnership with HSECH09 North Dublin, and this event is aimed at parents nationally. This series hopes to support parents during the summer months where there's increased socializing. So in summary, the topics that we'll be covering are related to adolescence, substance use amongst teens, and drug prevention and education. I will be delighted to introduce our expert panel, Professor Bobby Smith, Consultant Child and Adolescent Psychiatrist, Emer Lockery, Counsellor, and Dr. Monica White, Systemic Family Psychotherapist. From the previous seminar, many of you got in touch with questions following the event, and these questions are provided with a good basis for today's webinar. And before we start going through these questions, I would also ask you that you ask questions in the chat box provided, and we will attempt to get through as many of these in the time we're allocated. So without further delay, I suppose the theme of the questions that we've found, I would like to offer up the first question, which is question 1. What happens to the brain during adolescence? And I'd like to open that up to the panel.
Okay, thanks very much, Jason. I might start off with that one. So this is a general question, I suppose, and really important for us to know about as parents, that the human brain goes through a process of ongoing development and change, I suppose, across the adolescent years. And that's relatively new information. We've only grown to understand that over the last 15, 20 years or so. And that process of brain development doesn't fully, I suppose, end until the early or mid 20s. And that's relevant to this topic this evening about substance use for a couple of reasons. One is that the way the brain develops is sort of in a bottom to top type manner, with the prefrontal cortex, the bit at the front of the brain, being the last bit to fully mature. And that bit of the brain is a little bit like the brain's sort of braking system. It's sort of the sensible or cautious bit of the brain that maybe vets are scrutinizes urges and impulses that are coming up from maybe more primitive parts of the brain, the limbic system and so on, and decides, yeah, we'll do that, and no, we won't do the other. But it's the last bit of the brain to fully mature. So teenagers are slightly disadvantaged, I suppose, when it comes to appraising risk. They're a little bit in charge forward mode and not so good at pressing the pause button. And part of the message there for us as parents and adults around the teenagers is part of our job is to actually sort of be like the braking system on their behalf. That's one point. And I suppose the other bit of the brain development piece, our brain development story, is that it's a delicate process. New connections are being established between brain cells. The connections that are being maintained are covered with a layer of sort of fatty insulation. So you then get faster communication between cells. So you end up with a faster, more efficient brain at the age of 25 than you had at the age of 12. But again, as I said, it's a delicate process, and the concern about introducing substances during the adolescent years is that it can maybe derail or interfere with that process. And there is evidence that for substances like alcohol and cannabis, that teenagers who use a lot of those substances during their teenage years, that their brain seems to be changed by that, and that's probably not a good thing. I suppose that's why the issue of brain development is important. And I suppose as a team, you know, I work with Monica and Emer in our adolescent addiction service, and I suppose this is an issue that we encounter, and we also, I suppose, encounter those variations, don't we? In that not every teenager develops at the same pace, or maybe even reaches the same endpoints. And I suppose that issue of neurodiversity and variation in development is something we're seeing in more of the young people we meet. I don't know if either of you want to comment.
Yeah, certainly, Bobby, I can. I mean, I think you've captured it all. I think what we would see particularly around neurodiversity is that, you know, one size fits all, that people don't actually develop at the same time in the same pace, and they are developing in context of a family as well. So one child might develop quite quickly, other children won't develop as fast, depending on what's happening. So I think we can't say that everybody develops at the same pace. But I think, again, it's looking at neurodiversity, learning issues can have a big impact on how people begin to navigate the world and how their brain develops in a separate way, in different ways for each different child.
And I guess that's one of the challenges for us as parents, isn't it? That our kids differ, you know, and parenting approaches that work for one won't necessarily be appropriate for another.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's, I suppose, the core message, one of the messages from this evening is kind of like getting to know your child and figuring out what works for them. So tonight we are going to give some, hopefully some helpful ideas and thoughts, but you know, I'm always afraid of that word expert, but the truth is the experts here are the parents, and the parents actually do know their kids best. So it is about kind of figuring out, and not sometimes always measuring one child against the other, because the parenting approach you're going to use for one adolescent in your family could be a bit different for the next child in that same family. So we do have to keep an eye on what their different developmental needs are.
Yeah, although it's important maybe to mention that we are also experts by experience in this issue too. We're all parents of teenagers as well, or certainly have been, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Jason, do you have another question?
So I suppose really coming, and it kind of leads on to the next question, which was, what is happening to teens during adolescence, I suppose, from a psychological perspective?
Yeah, and I think I was going to kind of look at that. I mean, when we look at the development from a young person, like a preteen to a teenager, there's rapid changes going on all of the time. Bobby's highlighted the changes in the brain. Bodies are developing, we're getting puberty, all of those things are kind of developing and changing as a young person is growing up. So the physical changes tend to come first, obviously, and that leads to a step change in brain development, where we have increasing outward focus rather than a young person being focused on just mom, dad, family, school. They begin to be much more focused on who am I, what am I doing, what am I about, am I male, female, what gender, my gender identity, my gender expression, all of these things that we growing up didn't really have to worry about. Young people now will tend to have a lot more going on around different things, their moral development, you know, what type of a person am I, what are my core ideas, what do I like to do and not like to do. And then of course we have the whole social identity development of where is my place in the world, what kind of tribe, you know, young people talk about my tribe, my network, all of those things are happening in adolescence. And drug using and exposure to substances are part of that as well. Unfortunately, in Ireland, we can't avoid. We have a large drinking culture. We have a large kind of culture of using substances for births, marriages, deaths, all of that sort of stuff. So our young people are making sense of that as they go along, and all of that development is happening at the same time. So depending on where we live, if we live in a rural area, if we live in an urban area, our development will actually be paced along those lines. Rural kids can sometimes develop in different ways, kids from inner cities develop in different ways. And then you also have the individual trajectory that a young person has, whether they're first child, middle child, last child, what stage their family development is at, will also have a big influence on how they psychologically develop. And then things like school. So we would tend to look on adolescence as kind of a bridge to adulthood. where people are making those connections into the wider world. And Bobby has a great phrase that he always uses, which is apprentice adults. You know, if we see our adolescents as apprentices, an apprentice we'd normally give a good bit of support to if we were in the workplace with them. So particularly we see young people as apprentice adults. The parents have a huge impact on how their teens are shaped and formed. Impact in a positive way, but also can have an impact in a negative way. So we need to be aware as parents and as adults that our impact on our young people is very, very significant, and on their development is significant as well. Well,
Yep.
I think if there's
Uh,
anything, go ahead.
With that
Bobby.
apprenticeship idea as well, I suppose it's you know, as people go through any sort of apprenticeship, they tend to get incremental sort of amount of autonomy and freedom. They're getting more competent and capable, and that's what we see happening to our sons and daughters as they move towards adulthood. And our job ultimately is to support them to become fully independent, capable, functioning adults who are able to manage the world on their own 2 feet. But that requires some degree of exposure to responsibility and taking care of themselves and managing a range of situations, I suppose.
I think on that exposure, Bobby, as well, I suppose, to remind ourselves that they're learning from us as their parents, no pressure. They're learning from the family they're growing up in, and they're learning from the community and the friends that are around them. So I suppose that apprenticeship kind of learning space is happening in lots of different arenas, kind of all at the same time. So I just kind of to remind ourselves that all those spaces become really, really important actually during the adolescent stage.
And I think also to mention, because we haven't mentioned it yet, pandemic has had an enormous impact on young people. And, you know, we have people coming from different cultures. We've families coming from different backgrounds, from sub-Saharan Africa, from Ukraine, who are all trying to fit into an Irish culture. So we have a lot of people who are working on several different fronts, and families working on several different fronts to try and launch an adolescent into adulthood. And those trajectories can be quite different coming from different cultures and different backgrounds.
Very true.
I suppose just to come in there, I suppose to ask the question, which is what substances are being used by teens that we know of currently?
Yeah, maybe I'll lead out on that one. Yeah, because I suppose it's during adolescent years that substance use tends to become or can become part of a young person's life. And I guess the first substance that young people tend to encounter in a culture like Ireland is certainly alcohol. Unfortunately, the average age for starting to drink in Ireland is about 15. You know, it used to be closer to 18 on average, going back maybe 50, 60 years ago. So we've allowed it drop a lot. But the good news is, I suppose, for parents, maybe we've stopped it continuing to drop, and there's definitely a growing minority of teenagers and their parents, I think, who've picked up the message about it being sort of risky and unhealthy. And there's a growing minority of teenagers who are delaying their entry into the world of drinking. The next most common substance, I suppose, is certainly cannabis. We'd know that maybe it's 20, 30% of teenagers will have tried cannabis by the time they leave secondary school. There's at least another third who've had the opportunity to use and who said no. So it's you know, it's a drug that your son or daughter is really likely to encounter during adolescent years. So it's definitely one to have conversations around or to be thinking about. And then I guess there's a wide range of other substances. Some of the ones that are in the media at the moment and have certainly become a little bit more fashionable or in vogue is nitrous oxide or fast gas, which is nitrous oxide is, you know, that's the drug that's in, say, gas and air that mothers may have encountered during labor, but it's the same chemical and just sort of used in higher quantities. It can produce an intense intoxication effect. That's become somewhat popular amongst some teenagers. Vaping, actually, just to digress slightly, we don't tend to think enough about cigarettes and smoking and nicotine, largely because we've been so successful actually over the last 25 years at persuading young people to avoid nicotine, which used to just mean smoking. Unfortunately, now vaping, though, has really escalated. And while there's upsides for a 40-year-old who's smoking 20 cigarettes a day to switch to vaping. There's no upsides to starting vaping nicotine at the age of 14 or 15, as unfortunately many young people are doing. So that is a real reason to worry. And there's other headline grabbing drugs, which we don't see huge quantities of, in fairness, in adolescence, like MDMA, which is ecstasy, or cocaine, and so on. They're the ones I can think of. Any other thoughts, Monica, Emer?
Ketamine, I suppose, and benzodiazepines are there in that kind of minority mix, but they're certainly presenting every now and again. But I would agree, it's predominantly cannabis we're seeing a lot of, a huge increase in vaping, and alcohol, I suppose, is probably the third kind of most common substance you see.
And parents tend to be quite conflicted around alcohol, you know, particularly as teens get a little bit older, around should I let them use it? Should I not let them use it? So all of those questions kind of are really important for parents to have a look at. But yeah, alcohol, I think, is in the mix a lot at the time. And it's a really, really difficult one for parents given our drinking culture in Ireland.
Yeah, oddly enough, if there is a gateway drug, actually, my view would be that it's alcohol. You know, for young people who certainly move into problems around cocaine, it's so often in the context of partying and hard partying and drinking lots, and in that context, they can get introduced to cocaine, particularly while they're intoxicated, and maybe make a decision they wouldn't normally make.
Okay. And I suppose substance use, and I suppose in my own experience, substance use and experimentation and addiction aren't often the same conversation. But in terms of addiction, how are we able to identify that in teenagers, and with all the changes, for example, with puberty and other psychological changes that are happening? And what does addiction look like in teenagers?
It's a really good question, Jason, and thanks for putting it out there. And I suppose that word addiction, I suppose I might just start with that, if that's okay, just to kind of flag. I suppose definitely with the under 18 population, we try and kind of steer away from that word addiction, and we kind of refer to it as problematic drug or alcohol use, or the relationship a young person is having with a particular chemical. And I suppose it's quite purposeful that we do it in that particular way, because it allows a family who are a big part of this issue. My volume is not great, is it?
I can hear you clearly. I can hear you anyway.
Okay.
Apologies.
There's a bit of interference noise in the background, but I'm not sure if anyone else is hearing that.
Yeah, sorry, Emer, I'm just going to come over the mic for a moment. If just when others aren't speaking, can you just mute yourself? Because I think that will cut out. There seems to be exactly what you said, Bobby, interference coming from somewhere. So if we just mute when we're not speaking, hopefully that will help. I know that adds to it, but it'll just make things clearer. Thank you.
Okay, so going back to that piece, Jason, it can look very different in each young person. I suppose we mentioned that whole piece of knowing your young person, what their needs are, where their developmental stages are at. Certainly what we have come across in our service is the young people that are coming with things like ADHD, ASD, autism, neurodiversity of one kind or another, dyslexia, dyspraxia. Certainly substance use will amplify and exaggerate some of those presentations. And that's where it can kind of get very, very complicated. But you definitely are looking at the substances getting the way of relationships with family, friends. We start to see kind of it affecting school, and the young person can tend to feel less motivated about participating in activities with family, with their activities in their community. So it can be a cross section of issues, and you know what, like these kind of things can creep upon families very, very quickly, and sometimes it can be hard to kind of see the red flags. What we actually wanted to do for this evening, we just felt that the best voices to kind of highlight what problematic drug and alcohol use is like is actually the parents and the young people themselves. So I kind of pulled one or two quotes. So I've the perspective of two parents here. So the first one is relating to weed, and the parent basically said that it happened so quickly before we knew it. We were in the depths of him not being in control. He was stealing money and building up a drug debt. So that'd be a young person where I suppose before the parents knew it, there was somebody knocking on the door saying, like, you know, your son owes us money. And that can be quite dramatic, and it doesn't always happen in that dramatic kind of a way. And then we have another parent here who we would have worked, who would have said that our daughter developed an issue with alcohol. It left us feeling completely out of control as parents, not knowing how to deal with it, at times thinking we had got it under control after serious incidences and massive calm and rational conversations with her, only to have it happen again. The same conversations, the same promises, good behavior for a while from what we could see, but no trust in the relationship at all. And I suppose there's a kind of an example of parents where we kind of say, you know what, you don't have to be on your own with this. And it can be really, really hard to navigate as a parent. And I mean, I'm a parent myself, and I work in this field, and, you know, it still is quite difficult sometimes to have kind of all the answers. And we've two quotes here from two young people. And I have to say, what we've learned mostly in my field is coming from the people and the young people themselves, and they've just got some great insight and wisdom to share with us. So the first young person is speaking about cannabis, and he says, so I started when I was 15, and was the last one of my friends to start smoking, which I think is kind of interesting. I just wanted to fit in with all of them, I suppose. And when Bobby and Monica were talking about, you know, adolescent development and the brain, that's a lot of what's going on for young people. They're trying to figure out, how do I fit in? How do I be a bit like everybody else? So we have this particular young boy actually was, you know, quite able in his sports field and quite strong, but he still felt that actually I'm not fitting in, I'm not good enough, and therefore smoking cannabis became one of his solutions. And the second young person here, he says that 6 months to a year before that feeling is so good, you want to experience that every single day of the week. Yeah, like I'd love to have that feeling on a Monday, never mind the Saturday and the Tuesday, sure, maybe Wednesday, Thursday and Friday. It just goes on, and eventually you just can't stop doing it. So I suppose a lot of the young people that we were working with would kind of say into about 6 months of probably potentially cannabis use, they would feel that they become quite dependent on it very, very quickly. And that's where we start to see young people running out of money, trying to figure out how they're going to pay for it. You start to see the escalations at home, pressure being put on parents. Sometimes escalations look like violence. And for other young people, that can look like some kind of avoidance. And that's why I would really urge people to don't be on your own trying to figure this out as a parent, trying to question, is this mental health? Is this substance use? Possibilities, it could be both. But you don't have to be on your own. Give services like ourselves around the country a shout and allow them to support you in trying to navigate where to go with things next. I hope it's a very short answer, and I know it's quite a complex piece to kind of get into, but I hope it touches on some of the points.
Bobby, nice
summary, but I think.
Pardon?
That's certainly a good summary of the sort of challenges we see in our work. So the conscious, I suppose, this evening is more about prevention, but
yeah,
it's certainly worth parents understanding how badly things can go wrong when they do go wrong. And these are, of course, part of the reasons why we're trying to do a better job at delaying and ideally avoiding, I suppose, young people's entry into this particular world.
Yeah.
So that brings us on to our next question, really, and it's very related. What are the mental health risks for teen substance use?
Yeah, I might start off on this one. So from a pure mental health perspective, you know, all of the risks associated with substance use, you can divide them up into maybe the short-term risks, which are very much linked to intoxication, whether that's alcohol, cannabis, cocaine. It's the immediate effect over the first few minutes or hours that the substance has on you. And people usually consume a substance, whether it's alcohol or a drug, hoping it's going to have a positive impact on their mood. But the reality is those impacts can be really unpredictable. Certainly with regard to alcohol, particularly if someone's mood isn't great beforehand, their mood can get worse. They can get angry, they can get aggressive. They can, if they're anyway sad or down, they can actually get more depressed, more low in mood. Combine them with being drunk and impulsive, that can certainly lead to, you know, self-harm behavior, perhaps in extreme cases. And as a psychiatrist, certainly I would have met lots and lots of people in emergency departments, you know, who while intoxicated engaged in self-harm. So there's certainly worries on the short term from a mental health perspective. There's also odd ones that you maybe wouldn't necessarily anticipate for drugs like cannabis, because we have this notion that cannabis is a chill out, relaxing sort of drug, and for many people who use it can be, but other people can get very anxious on it and get panic attacks. So it can have those sort of short-term impacts, and that actually causes people to attend emergency departments thinking they're having heart attacks and so on. Then you can get sort of longer term impacts, and we know that sort of young people who consume more alcohol or use more drugs, they show higher rates of depressed mood, and that can evolve into sort of full-blown depressions. And I guess just on that topic of mental health impacts, it's certainly worth mentioning, say, the rare but extremely severe impacts that particularly drugs can have, such as cannabis or cocaine, that can cause someone to tip into a state where they lose touch with reality, and it goes beyond just those few hours of being intoxicated, and they develop a psychosis. So that's particularly concerning, not terribly common, but a really concerning mental health outcome that can affect some young people. And certainly it's supposed to be clear, say, in terms of cannabis use during adolescence. For me, going back to the earlier points about the brain being a little bit vulnerable because it's during this process of development, I'm certainly convinced by the research at this stage, which indicates that cannabis use during adolescence on a regular basis around the age of 15, 16 does seem to increase people's risk of developing illnesses as serious as schizophrenia, albeit maybe in adulthood. It might double the risk from 1% to 2%. Still means the vast majority of teenagers who smoke cannabis get away with it, but a minority don't, and they pay a very big price. So they're the mental health risks that spring to mind.
Okay, and outside of mental health risks, what are the other risks of teen substance use?
Was I going to take this one as well? I think I am. So a lot of them come down to being intoxicated. Again, the short-term risks. When we're intoxicated, we tend to be a little bit more impulsive. Our judgment of risk isn't as good. That's not a great state to be in, maybe when you're in your 40s or 50s, but when you're 14 or 15 and already primed to go forward and not brilliant at assessing risk anyway, it can cause teenagers to make poor decisions and get themselves in trouble. It may be nothing more than doing or saying things that are embarrassing and come back to haunt them. And I guess in this modern world with social media, out with friends, people with cameras, some of those mistakes that perhaps many of us made during our youth, they can get recorded forever, and they can sort of be there to haunt you well beyond the next day and the next week, which is certainly a concern. Substance use, when people are intoxicated, they can also do things that get them in trouble with their neighbours, with the Gardaí at times as well. It can certainly have negative impacts on school and relationships and disengagement from sort of sporting activities and pro-social activities. And I suppose Emer maybe mentioned lots of those issues as well already. Is there anything I've forgotten about there, Emer, Monica?
I suppose for me, one of the things that we do hear lots of feedback around is, I suppose, that piece around exploitation for young people. So if they don't have the money to pay for whatever it is that they've been using on a regular basis, I suppose it's how they get access to that money. And sometimes there can be quite vulnerable to being exploited around, people offering them options as to how to pay for their I'm not even going to say debt, because a lot of the time it's not even considered in the young person's mind a debt. It's just that they need to access money and somebody's given them a quick and easy solution. It tends to be sometimes something that's going to put them in further risk. And I suppose one point that I will make is that if a young person, particularly when it comes to drugs, is actually purchasing substances, the likelihood is that they are going to get offered more than just the substance that they're actually going to buy. So it's a bit like going to a sweet shop. You might be going for a bar of chocolate, but there's also jellies being offered as well. So it's just something, I suppose, we see young people being exposed to further risk by sometimes taking one step into substance use.
And I think also, I mean, what I would say is also if a young person is neurodiverse, is kind of trying to navigate the world through a lens of, you know, not understanding social cues, sometimes that actually can have a big impact as well on their level of exploitation by other people too. And the ability to have fun without substances. You know, the substances tend to take over the reward circuit in the brain. So young people feel, well, okay, I'm having fun with my parents and family, but this would be much better if I had substances on board as well. So it's that kind of hijacking of what is fun, what is enjoyment, what is excitement. It tends to all get hijacked by the substance, and that can have a big impact in that young people stop wanting to be around friends and family and do normal stuff that would give them a normal high. So we tend to see a drop off in things like sports and engaging with family, engaging with cousins and other young peers. That tends to happen too.
I think that's a really good point. That bit of, you know, the journey kids are on, or trying to get them to adulthood. They need to, adults need to have relax and have fun. But if teenagers allow all socializing, all relaxing, all fun times to be dominated by alcohol, I suppose is the most common one, isn't it? The worry is that they'll arrive into they'll become adults who are unable to have a laugh and let their hair down without being intoxicated. So they're better off, I suppose, learning how to chill out and relax and enjoy time with their buddies and friends while sober. And if, as young adults, they want to add alcohol into the mix, so be it. And on the flip side of that, I suppose, as well as wanting our young people, our sons and daughters to have fun, we also want them to learn how to manage stress and difficulty and the bad days. And unfortunately, if they turn to alcohol or cannabis or some other drug to manage sort of emotional distress, I suppose, that can maybe get in the way of them learning more effective strategies for dealing with those challenges.
Okay, so I suppose this kind of brings us on to our next question, which relates to, I suppose, the signs that your son or daughter is developing a problem. I mean, how do parents identify those issues?
Hi, Jason. Yeah, I suppose we've kind of touched on it a little bit, and I suppose it's a real dilemma for parents, and one that many families do face. And I suppose it's trying to sometimes figure out, are we in a stage where the young person is simply experimenting and trying to figure out kind of about drugs and chemicals in general and how they affect themselves and their social ability, or is it something that's become a bit more problematic? And I suppose the first starting point for advice that we would give any parent is, it's really important to have the conversation with the young person. But I suppose timing is everything. So, you know, when that young person presents, I'm just going to take, for example, comes in this evening and they're really heavily under the influence, you know that they're off, their eyes aren't great, they're maybe stumbling a little bit, they're talking a little bit strange, you know, then is not the time to go challenging about what were you doing, where were you at, and what's going on. You know, you've got to come from a place of care and sincerity and genuine consideration for their safety in that immediate moment. There is a time for that conversation, absolutely. And the time is the following day when you've cooled down and when the young person is a bit more able to kind of hear what you're talking about. So we would have a little saying from a program that we're involved in called NBR, and it's called Striking When the Iron is Cold. So it's always kind of having those conversations in a moment of time. And you as a parent, you've really got to regulate your own emotions, because if you overreact, you're going to shut the conversation down. And this is at a time in a young person's life where you really need to try and keep those conversations open, and you want them to feel like you're there to support them. Okay, you're not going to be delighted with the fact that they've come in a state, but they need to know that you're there to kind of help them through this kind of stage and to kind of figure out how they might do things a bit safely and differently the next time. And coming in and shouting and giving out much noise, you might want to do that, but coming in and doing that might actually close things down, which means that you can't help them navigate the risk for the next time something like this is going to actually happen. And it is a time of learning, and it is going to be a time of making mistakes. And I mean, I really do feel for this generation, because because as Bobby said, their lives are being videoed and recorded, so they can't really make mistakes either without being reminded of the mistakes that that they've made. So so those signs are some of the stuff we've already talked about, which is drop in motivation, poor mood, escalation maybe in violence or aggression in the house, and dropping out of the activities that they normally have liked, pulling away from family in a way that seems kind of unusual. We would always encourage parents, trust your gut actually. Most times parents will come to us and 10 times out of 10, they've been actually correct that there was something wrong. They just couldn't put their finger on it. And I suppose with some further work and conversations, they were able to get to the bottom of what was really happening. But certainly the feedback we've got from the young people themselves is what was most helpful was when their parents actually listened, showed curiosity, showed empathy, and then gave them clear messages of what was okay and what was not okay, and tried to kind of help them think about how best to manage the situations, for future. But not an easy one, Jason, and it's certainly not a black and white answer, unfortunately.
I do think that point, Emer, about trusting your gut is important. Things just don't seem right. It's probably about just sharing that concern or that observation with your son or daughter. Don't leap in and sort of say, are you doing drugs? That's just going to shut down the conversation, even if they are. But just to comment to them that you just don't seem yourself lately. You seem in bad form. You're never here. Is there something up? I'm a bit worried about you. And see where the conversation goes. It's coming from that position of concern and curiosity is more likely to elicit information than finger pointing and accusations.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that we didn't mention was looking at, connecting with other parents, making sure that you're aware of who the parents of the other children that your young person is around with. Because again, that parents network can be a really valuable kind of source of information. Because we would find sometimes people would say, oh, I'm going over to Jimmy or Johnny's or Jane's or whatever. And if a parent isn't checking, are they coming to your house? Our young person can be out and about, and parents don't really know where they are. So we talk about parental presence and making those connections with other parents, and checking in and saying, is it all right if they come to your house? All of this sort of stuff. Now that might seem a bit difficult when they're 16, 17 and coming up to 18. But again, we would see that, when parents are hands-on and involved, a young person feels much more held in that network. We call it kind of the scaffolding around a young person, that they know that, okay, if I'm going to John or Jim, my mum might be texting John or Jim to say, well, is it okay for you with your mum that you can come over? So it's stuff like that that's really important as well.
And I really like your point as well, and points there that were made, because demonstrating to your child that you're actually comfortable to have that conversation invites future conversations that may be quite difficult for your child to approach. So some really good points there. And I suppose really from the point of view of the importance of the influence of parents, but also influences outside of the parents. So the next question relates to different influences on teenagers, schools, culture, society, social media, peers, as well, and obviously parents. So what are those different influences, and could somebody please expand on those?
Yeah, I suppose we would always kind of start with the parents, particularly during the adolescent years, are the biggest influencers of change, actually. And for parents to kind of really trust that and really believe that is actually quite real in everything we've seen. But we also know there's always a push-pull that's happening during adolescence, and we've touched on it already in terms of the friends they have, what's the kind of norm within their group of what happens in that group. Does everybody use cannabis? Does everybody drink alcohol? Have you got permission to say, no, this is not really my kind of thing? So what are the norms that are happening within the peer group itself? So school has a massive impact, and not just in terms of the peers that are in the school, but I suppose how the young person feels supported and understood. And I suppose, is it a strengths focus, kind of education system that the young person's in, and do they feel that actually it's allowing them and helping them to fulfill their potential? I suppose outside of the school and outside of community, and community is quite huge because it plays a big part in what we like to call pro-social behaviours. So what the young person's involved in, whether it's drama, art, kickboxing, boxing, football, whatever the kind of thing, the activities a young person's involved in, but they all have a great influence. And you often I hear a lot of young people kind of, making reference to their coaches or their leaders or their facilitators who they actually really look up to. And they would always say, like, if so-and-so hears I'm doing this, it's going to, I'm going to get into a lot of trouble, or he'd be really disappointed in me, he might drop me from the team. So again, that one good adult concept is really, really important. And sometimes community members mightn't even realize how important their role is to a young person. We can never get away, unfortunately, from social media at the moment. It's massive. It's a big part of lots of people's lives, not just adolescents, parents included. But I suppose what we hear a lot of is the advertising that goes on, particularly through Snapchat and Instagram, where a lot of young people are kind of it's particularly around Patrick's Day and holiday seasons like Christmas and Easter, and party packs and special offers, just like you see in Dunn's and Aldi, except it's in terms of a substance use piece. So a lot of those advertisements can be quite tempting for a young person, and a lot of them will be kind of low cut and advantageous to take advantage of, but it can be quite hard when that kind of is coming in on your media stream. And on average, a lot of the young people are spending a lot of hours, like, it's good for parents to sit down and kind of have a check and have a conversation. What's your screen time like today? And mine is blah, and yours is blah. Maybe we need to kind of maybe spend a little bit less time on social media, but it is a massive influence on how young people think, how they feel they should fit in, and what they feel is acceptable. And there's that push-pull that's happening throughout adolescence. So there's a lot of influences happening there for them. But we would really tonight is really about parents, and parents recognize and keep an eye on the fact that they're watching you. They're watching how you cope with your emotions. I was coming home in traffic this evening, and I swear to God, I probably was a bad example of managing my feelings because it was taking ages to get home. But kids our adolescents are watching how we regulate. Are we coming home and on a Friday, are we going straight to the fridge for a bottle of wine, or are we having other activities before we might do something like that? So we are role modeling all the time, and they are watching us and will not always copy us, but I suppose those values are there, and are embedded in how young people kind of view the world. So the influences are great. Anybody else want to chime in there?
Yeah, no, I think you've summarized it terribly well there, Emer. There's a multitude of influences. Parents are probably the biggest single one, yeah. And I guess we've assessed ourselves in terms of what are the positive influences: school, hobbies, interests, the other good adults that our young people encounter. And Monica's point about that being the scaffolding around them. And I guess what we can influence, even when we're not present, anything we as parents can do to, for as long as possible, keep our sons and daughters surrounded by as many of those positive influences as possible. That's all good. That's all protective. That's all going to reduce likelihood of things going askew.
Yeah.
Okay, so I suppose this next question feels like we've been kind of leading up to this one. So what can parents do to reduce the risks of a teen developing a substance use problem?
Yeah, and I think I was going to lead out on this one, because I think for us, what we really look at is, parents are a primary relationship, and the best expert on a child is a parent. So a lot of the time we have kind of 4 areas that we look at with a young person and with a parent. And their relationship is key, first of all, particularly to build a close relationship with your teen. Teenagers are really, really difficult. They're going through difficult times. They're coping with multiple contexts. Now, some people sail right through teenage years and parents haven't got a real bother about them. Other teenagers find it really difficult to navigate. So they do rely on that scaffolding of parents. And that's why we kind of talk about, Emer has a great phrase for it, which she calls hurdle help. I tend to call it scaffolding. So a lot of the time we tend to encourage parents to talk openly and honestly about the risks of alcohol and drugs in an age appropriate way, to actually, as your teenager gets older and they get exposed to more different types of drugs in their environment and their peers, again, to allow those conversations to happen, not to shut it down, to be open and honest about what's out there, what you're concerned about, and how to help them to navigate that. Parental presence is the next one that we talk about. We can't kind of overestimate the impact of parental presence, whether you're actually physically dropping them and connecting them from social events, because you can see, okay, who are they hanging around with? What state are they in when they're coming out of the disco or the party or whatever? You know, parental presence with other parents as well, to create those kind of networks where you're checking out, is this a safe environment for your young person to be in? Because sometimes we get it wrong. You know, we've all sent our kids off to a party where we think, okay, God, I shouldn't have done that. That wasn't a great one to send them to. Or they come back and say, look, I didn't really have a great time. So again, if you're in the car and collecting them, or if you're at the end of the bus and collecting them, or they know that you're on, you know, fairly close to them, you're able to kind of debrief them quite quickly after that and say, okay, well, maybe that's not a great group to hang around with. So parental presence is really one of the things that we look at. Boundaries, then the next thing, are set boundaries and stick to them. So having boundaries around what you feel is acceptable use of substances as they get older. If you are allowing your young person to use alcohol at a younger age, you may find that, okay, the boundaries are going to be pushed a lot sooner. So somebody starting to drink at 14 and 15 will start to drink much more consistently at 16 or 17. Whereas we would always find the longer we can postpone those kind of exposures to alcohol and other substances, the more chance we have of young people being able to regulate their use of those substances much better, because they've lots of other things going on, like the sport, family and friends and all of those things. So set boundaries. Try not to give alcohol to under 18s. As I'm saying it, I know it's kind of ridiculous in Ireland, but again, as the health service, we would kind of try and stick to that. But the longer we can postpone that exposure, the better. And the other one, which is really key for parents, is set a good example. Emer's mentioned before, if you're heading for the fridge on Friday evening because you've had a stressful week, your young person is going to be saying, well, that's how you cope with stress. When you're an adult, you head for the fridge and take out the bottle of wine. Or if you're, you know, smoking a joint yourself, you can't really say to a young person, well, I don't want you doing that as well. So again, setting a good example and modeling ways of coping. We call it modeling, where you're actually beginning to show a young person, this is how I cope with stress. This is how our family copes with difficult periods of time, in that we kind of go for the walk, go talk to one another, and then we might think about maybe decompressing with a glass of wine or something like that. So again, it's setting a good example is the important thing, because young people will pick up more at home and more in their community of how older adults actually handle substances. That will have a bigger impact on them. And the other thing, the biggest motivator that we also look at is our young people don't want to lose the respect of their parents a lot of the time. So if you're saying to them, look, when you see them making great choices around substances, you have to praise them. Emer would always say that when we see a young person making a great choice around substances, it's like Christmas. You have to say, look, I'm really proud of you. You did wonderfully. You went to that party. XYZ came out of the door and I saw them falling out the door and you came out walking with your head held high. I'm great. That's great. I'm really proud of you. So you do have to praise when you see that behavior where they are managing to navigate a difficult social environment. And that's really important as well. Anybody else?
I think that point, Monica, of it, you know, there is a real culture of drinking in Ireland. It's maybe changing very slowly, but it is still highly normalized. And you know, it's genuinely tough for teenagers to make the healthy decision all the time. But I do think as parents, it is useful to maintain that expectation that they avoid drinking. I think the evidence really, and this is pretty clear at this stage, that parents who give their sons and daughters permission to drink at the age of 15, 16, those sons and daughters on average end up drinking more and getting into bigger problems around alcohol than parents who deny that permission. And you know, it's not that denying permission eliminates the behavior. It certainly doesn't, but it does seem to make it less likely that our kids head into drinking careers at a young age. And also, if they do drink, they seem to do a little bit of a better job at keeping a lid on it. And you know, if there is a rule, and I would encourage there to be a rule that there be no drinking, under the age of 18, if someone crosses the line, and you're probably going to police that, more vigorously at the age of 14 than you might at the age of 17, there's some sort of a consequence. It's maybe your pocket money's cut in half for a week, or you have to come in an hour earlier the next night. It's not the end of the world, but it's been unambiguous, I suppose, in your message that I think this is a bad idea. Going back to all the points we made earlier about those risks, about brain development and so on, there's piles of reasons why it's a bad idea for kids to head into this world at a young age. And it's okay for us to have a high level of expectation that they look after themselves and their futures.
I think it's okay for parents to, that whole piece of parental presence, like it's okay to say to your young person, listen, do you mind if you send me a text when you get there, or I might actually throw you a call at 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock. I'd like just to check in with you, know that you're okay. And you'll be surprised the amount of parents that we've got feedback on who've actually done that. And when they've made that call, they've noticed something is off by actually having that phone conversation, because at the end of the day, what your child's voice sounds like. And that's where you can be a real support by kind of, when things are off, kind of saying, listen, do you want me to come and collect you? Sounds like things mightn't be the easiest at the moment, or you might be full of yourself. And you'd be surprised, actually, some young people kind of go, oh yeah, actually you're right, maybe it is time for you to go home, can you give me a lift? But if you haven't had that contact or that connection, it can be hard to kind of keep them safe. And I suppose that's what all this is about. This whole conversation is, how do we help our kids get through adolescent years as safely as possible? And a lot of parents sometimes will kind of say, well, does he really want me in him or her life or their lives? We would kind of say, yes, encourage it, have that expectation that, I do want to know where you are in case something goes wrong, that I'm there and I can pick you up and get you out of that situation. That's what being an apprentice is. They're not going to get it right all the time.
So I suppose I'm looking at the chat as well, questions that are coming up, and it's very related to the next question, which is it really possible to maintain a warm and positive relationship and also set boundaries and rules? And I suppose the reason I say it's related to the chat, be that a 16-year-old who is, for example, looking to go out drinking with his friends, or people who are getting involved in unsupervised drinking, and how parents can manage that. So these conversations about how you set boundaries and how you maintain that relationship. Who would like to answer that question?
I think I can kind of answer that one. I think we do find, even with our clientele, that we can actually see that when parents begin to set boundaries and develop the relationship with their young person, that it does have a huge effect on how a young person kind of relates to their substance use as well. So a lot of the time when we look at setting boundaries and rules, it's for young people to have a clear idea around what your expectation as a parent is. If you're kind of saying, okay, if you're going out with your friends and I expect you to come home sober, rather than say, I want you to come home sober, I expect is a really good kind of phrase to use. I expect you to make good choices. Because again, what you're doing then is you're calling into that you're calling into that relationship with them. And I think it's really important also to look at, sometimes we do say to parents, it's okay to step into that place of, my mum says I can't, because sometimes we expect our young people to be able to say no in every context to every substance. When they have pressure from teens and when they have pressure from other peers, sometimes that's really difficult, particularly if they don't want to be seen as somebody who's not able to go places. But sometimes when parents say, well, no, you can't go somewhere and I don't want you going, that actually frees up some of our young person, because they can say, well, my ma says I can't go, or my dad says I can't go. And that actually, other teenagers understand that, okay, his dad says he can't go, rather than what John or Jim doesn't want to come with us. So sometimes parents actually having a boundary and having a rule actually allows a young person to use a parent as a resource to say, well, I don't actually have to say no to my friends, but I can say my mum or dad doesn't want me going, and I can't go. So that's one thing that sometimes parents find difficult to do, to step into that parental space and put down a clear boundary. So we would say, yeah, it is possible to maintain a warm and positive relationship. It's freedom within the supports, to allow young people, as they make good choices, you're saying, okay, well, you made a great choice. then maybe you can go to the next party and maybe just give me a text, and I'll, check in with you once during the night instead of twice or 3 times during the night. So again, as you're building trust with your young person, now there may be speed bumps along the way, that they may make a bad choice one night, and particularly how you react to those bad choices are really important. We would always say, look at your own anxiety level as a parent as well. First of all, when something bad happens, we as parents have to hold our own anxiety first of all, and not transfer that onto the young person of, what happened? Why did you do this? Why did you do that? Why did you do the other? So again, striking when the iron is cold, holding on to your own anxiety and not launching into something at the wrong pace and at the wrong time, as Emer said earlier on, is really, really important. But building that warm relationship with your own young person, where they have the freedom to tell you when things have gone wrong, and that they know that you're not going to overreact and, have a major meltdown yourself, that you're going to react calmly. So that's kind of what we look at in our parenting program as well, of not escalating and keeping calm, being the adult in the situation, being the strong anchor for your young person, so that you can kind of allow them the freedom to go out and learn how to navigate all these social environments, but they have a strong anchor to hold them as well. I'll let Bobby and Emer, if you want to join in, if there's something I've missed.
This is one of the things I suppose I always am aware of is, as you correctly said, Monica, there will be speed bumps along the way, and young people will make mistakes and do the wrong thing. And sometimes parents can then become quite extreme in their response, and I suppose bar them from doing everything and anything. And I suppose, again, I'll be just cautious about overly punishing and over the top consequences, because again, that's going to stop them telling you the next time when something else has gone wrong. And just on that, a lot of young people will test the waters with their parents by telling them something that somebody else has done in the peer group, and they're checking to see what your reaction is to that. Chances are it might be something that has actually happened to them, but they're checking to see how you're going to respond to that before they're going to tell you anymore. So I'd always be conscious about how that, not being too judgy or over judgmental about maybe any of their peers, or something maybe one of their peers have done, because the chances are that could be something that has happened for them. And again, it's about keeping that kind of communication line open.
Yeah, and I think on that, it's probably about trying to constantly come from that position of concern as opposed to anger. And your anxiety can quickly morph into anger. And if you're met with, you might be coming from a position of concern, your son or daughter reacts angrily, and then anger is met by anger because they flare you up. To really work hard, you're only setting rules, not to mess up their life and to make their summer miserable. You're setting rules and boundaries because you're trying to keep them safe and well, which is not a bad thing to want to do. And even if they think you worry too much and are too concerned, well, better that than have a parent perhaps who worries too little. And certainly what will make it easier to set boundaries during adolescence is if your son or daughter has grown up in a home where there's been rules since there's always been rules. There's always been some sort of coming in time or going to bed time when they were a kid. So they're used to the fact that you love them and you care for them and you worry a little bit, and you've got some rules about keeping them safe and well. So it's not some shocking new introduction during adolescence, because that's when you'll certainly get loads of pushback if they've grown up in a home where there's never really been rules monitoring consequences. So it's better if it's something they've grown up with. And equally, if ideally, I think you're in that mode of monitoring and consequences 5% of the time as a parent, and 95% of the time you're trying to work on the warmth and connection and communication and being interested and involved in their life, even to the point of almost annoying them.
And is there an age where these conversations you think should start happening?
I think as early as possible. I suppose substances and chemicals are around from very young ages. Like, kids will see parents getting sick or having a headache, or they'll come in and say, I hurt myself. And I suppose that's when you start those conversations, like, okay, you have a headache. The child might say, can I have a paracetamol or a tablet? I would say to parents, encourage the young person to go into the room, lie down, close the curtains, that there's ways in which they can rely on their own bodies and their own coping strategies around them to kind of get through even kind of unpleasant physical, medical kind of pain in those early stages. But I think having age appropriate conversations about substances and, you know, the risks of accidentally taking something they shouldn't take. I think those conversations have to start early in life. It shouldn't be a shock. That you only start talking about it in teenage years.
And I think the other thing we look at is, you know, sometimes a lot of what young people are being exposed to in school around the SPHE program.
Yeah.
One of the topics is, you know, substance use, what you take into your body, nutrition, all of that sort of stuff. So I think to normalize conversations about healthy substances, not so healthy substances, things that you shouldn't be using a lot or things that you should be using a little. You know, if kids are getting used to that from, you know, seeing it in the supermarket, you know, that you shouldn't be eating this, that, or the other very often. Again, it should be normalized like that, you know, we use substances very rarely in our house. Other houses might be quite different. They might use them a bit more, but this is what we do in our house, in our family, you know. So to give them that this is a family choice that we're doing it this way. So.
Okay, and I suppose just looking at the questions that are within the chat as well, and that conversation that you have with your child, when the question comes back at parents, have you ever tried drugs? I suppose, how would you go about answering that? For example, if you had experimented or had a previous issue with substance misuse yourself.
That's a tough one in some ways, because my general advice would be not to engage in war stories, and maybe where that happens most regularly with kids in an Irish context is when you catch up with friends or buddies or family and people start reminiscing about your past adventures in your youth, which is often, you know, an interesting conversation to have with your friends. If you've got young ears in the background, whether it's your 6-year-old or your 16-year-old, they're going, "Oh, that's what Dad was up to when he was young." It's probably to be mindful of the fact that we shouldn't be talking about our past misadventures with alcohol or other drugs in a way that sort of glorifies it or makes it seem like it was glamorous, and we're probably remembering some of those adventures ourselves or issues or events with rose-tinted glasses. So I'd be certainly wary of sharing any past experience of drug use. A question that's come up in the past, I suppose, is parents who've had past issues with addiction, and I think that tends to be that's not one that's going to be hidden, because that will be known, you know, and that's one to definitely talk about. How people can, you know, mums and dads aren't perfect either. We can run into difficulties, and certainly if we're through those difficulties, it's no harm to certainly talk about them, and the challenges it brought into our lives at the time, and what we learned from it and how we escaped it.
And I think, sorry, Jason, one of the things that we always look at is also to kind of define it in terms of our relationship with substances as well. You know, that we as adults can have had difficult relationships with substances at different times in our lives that may not have been healthy. So looking at framing it in different ways is really important to say, well, okay, my relationship with substances may not have been great, did not make great choices when I was younger. That's why I'm really looking at trying to talk to you early, trying to make sure that you're protected, and that you make better choices than I did. You know, so again, it's kind of how you frame it for a young person is important.
I like your previous point, Monica, as well, about ensuring the conversations are age appropriate.
Yeah.
And that probably very relevant here as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm conscious of time, and I know a lot of questions came through, and I suppose just for one last question very quickly, just our advice for parents whose teens are going to either their first festival or festivals over the next few weeks. What advice would we give parents?
I'll have a go at that. your sons and daughters are they're going to be in situations where people are using substances, whether that's going to parties at the age of 15, 16, alcohol is highly likely to be present. Festivals, again, is maybe, even more likely perhaps, and the menu of substances will be wider, more than likely. Festivals do seem to differ a lot. Some, almost as far as I can see, seem to be drug festivals at which there's some music, and then there's other music festivals at which there's some drug use. So I think it's a perfect time to have a conversation about, how do they think they're going to manage that? What do they think they'll do? Or they might sort of say, well, I won't touch anything. Then you can be curious, well, why won't you? Or what would stop you? Just to be curious and to get them thinking about it, talking about it. But again, age appropriate, moving out into the adult world is all grand, including the risks that come with it, because to some extent that's how they learn. I do worry that some young people are flinging themselves into risky, more adult situations too young. You've got to trust your own judgment in some ways as how well they've managed freedoms you've given them in the past, as to whether or not you sort of give your agreement to their future proposals.
I think it's just on that point, Bobby, it's that gradual exposure. It's kind of like when, if you've kind of been very kind of protective of them in those early years, and then all of a sudden you're kind of letting them go to festivals, you really absolutely have to have those conversations, because they're not going to have the breaks that you might expect them to have, because they haven't had that gradual exposure. I would always come from the point of view of safety first. They need to know where the safety tents are, where the medical supports are. If it's not for them, it could be for one of their friends. As Bobby said, they're going to witness other young people potentially substance using as well. So they need to you need to be quite open about those conversations, and being, curiously supportive about what are you going to do if you get offered some ketamine? What are you going to do? Do you even know what it looks like? How would you know if somebody was really in trouble with one of those drugs? And obviously the HSE have some really good resources on festival drugs in the HSE. So I'd be kind of pointing people in that direction, to, in advance of some of the festivals. And again, that's
the drugs.ie website, isn't it?
That's the drugs.ie.
So it's just a simple name to remember, drugs.ie. Yeah.
Right. And I think the final thing would be to look at the kind of what your young person is asking you. If they're saying, well, everybody is going and everybody else is going to be doing X, Y, Z, particularly around young people are great at negotiating beforehand of, can I have a 0-0? Can I have 2 cans of this? Can I have whatever? So again, to have thought about it yourself, first of all, of what am I giving permission to? If I'm giving them permission to go to the festival, what else is involved in that? What am I comfortable with as a parent? What am I not comfortable with? Because I think your young person will be already able to negotiate with you around what are the things that they might be exposed to, because their friends are probably all talking about it anyway, even before the tickets are bought. It's kind of like, what we're going to be doing and how we're going to be doing that. So again, it's important that you have decided first of all as to what is my stance on festivals. What is my stance on drug use or alcohol use at festivals or parties? That's the kind of important thing as well for parents to have. And also, if you're in single parenting or in a parent relationship with husband, spouse, partner, whatever it is, that you're both on the same page. That's really important. And because a lot of the time we would find that one parent may be slightly wishy-washy on one thing and another parent will be very strong. And so to have an agreed stance on what happens with your partner, if your partner parenting on your own, to have a clear idea for yourself, but also to have a conversation with your partner. Because young people, if they see that there's a difference in the parental system, they will go for it, and they will
to be on the same hymn sheet is really important.
Yeah,
and if you're not, you need to have a chat together and reach a compromise, so that at least your son or daughter sees you on the same hymn sheet.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. I suppose I'd like to start concluding. So first of all, I'd like to say that there's been quite a few questions, Q&As, and I just advise anybody to contact drugs.ie. Your questions will be answered on there. Also, it helps us inform any future webinars as well. So I'd like to thank everybody for your input on that. Lastly, I'd like to thank our expert panel, Professor Bobby Smith, Emer Lockery, and Dr. Monica White. Thank you so much for your expert opinions. It's been very valuable and very enlightening. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jason.